Back in the early 1600s, there was a poet and a scholar by the name of John Donne, who also became a cleric of the Church of England back then, who wrote a poem that has been quoted quite extensively since then. And it started something like this, and it says that no man is an island entire of itself. Every piece is part of the continent, a part of the main. Well, I kind of disagree with John Donne that no man can become an island. Well, I recognize that John was writing in a contemporary sense in poetic form about the unity of Europe back during the upheaval times of the early 1600s. However, about 1600 years before that, there was a group of people that were distinct from society, distinct like an island out of the sea. They were not part of the main at all. Larry Gerardo, in his book Destroyer of the Gods, actually addresses this group of people who had a different type of faith that was common to the people that lived in the first century Greco Roman era. Hello, everybody. I'm David Lott. We're going to go back in time a little bit here with Larry Gerardo and look at this group of people who were so distinct in their time, who actually did set themselves up as an island in a sea, out of the sea of humanity and the sea of the pantheon of gods. At that time, they were distinct. They were not part of the main at all, and they were entirely of themselves. So let's take a journey backwards in time a little bit. Gerardo opens up his second chapter with a question. And the question is, do you believe in God? Obviously, most of us do. All of us do. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be in this discussion at all. But some say no, not from our group, but others. Some say maybe because they just don't know. We have the atheist who do not want to even enter the discussion. And we have the agnostics, and they have their own issues. And of course, we have other denominations that have their own belief systems. Our understanding of God is developed from three prongs. One is we have the written word of God that's been recorded over history from many, many different traditions. We have the testimony of the incarnate Jesus, but we also have the impact of the early church, the early group of believers during the first century AD Roman era. But what you and I believe about God today has not been the status quo over history. In fact, if we look back at history, what you and I believe actually was just an assumption. This is what some people believe. It's just we're just assuming that. They don't have proof of it. Gerardo is showing, and will show, is that what we believe today, even though it's an assumption over history, and it was opposition to the status quo of the first century, actually it was a new type of faith that has survived time. Gerardo wishes to discuss the distinctiveness of Christianity out of the first century AD by discussing his definition of religion. And he calls religion a human activity. And so that he allows us to discuss this concept of distinctiveness. He says that in our culture, we look at our denominations and our religion as distinct from our everyday life or from our work or play or whatever we do. He said, however, in first century AD, religion, the human activity, was part of everyday life. It ingrained every facet of life. And every one of those facets of life, the people had gods for them. Now I'm talking about little g, not big G gods. And they had gods for them, and every god deserved respect, and every god deserved reverence. That was their culture. They had gods for everything because people were from everywhere. There was gods from Egypt, gods from Macedonia, gods from Palestine, gods from Greece, and obviously all the Roman deities they had, and the little deities and big deities. There was geographies for the areas, obviously we just talked about, cities, places, people, gods for acts of nature such as the need rain, gods for family issues such as fertility, want a child. It was for any group of people to do not provide reverence or respect to one of these little gods was considered heresy to them. It was to deny the existence of that God, and that was not acceptable at all within their culture at all. It was so ingrained it became part of the economic fabric of life. They had massive building projects. I've been to the Parthenon. I've seen all the little temples and the little shrines in the hills around and up and down the path. They had priests, they had sacrifices. The building of idols, the little silversmith things that Paul's talk about, the massive art projects of marble, where they build these cultic images of the gods. It was very ingrained. They had festivals and they built their calendars around it. This God reverence, this God respect, little g, was so ingrained in their society, their culture was actually defined by it. If we were to go back and look at the metaphor of John Donne's sea, or the continent, this culture was basically a just big melting pot of reverence and respect for a multitude of gods and no distinction, just a big churning thing. And anything that was not in that stood itself apart. And this is what Gerardo was trying to make about this religion. How are we distinctive in our religious practices and beliefs versus their religious practices and beliefs? And he shows his distinctiveness by his definition of what religion is. It's about this human practice and beliefs. Herodotus shows that out of the first century AD in the Roman era, there arose a group of people who had a different type of faith. They didn't show the respect or the reverence that was expected of all citizens of Rome toward all the deities, all the multiplicity of gods from Rome and Egypt and Greece and Macedonia, the emperor gods, any of those gods. In fact, this group of people believed that respect and reverence was only deserved by one single God, big G, God, and none of these other mattered. They didn't have any shrines or temples or altars or priests or sacrifices. They didn't participate in festivities or any of the cultural happenings around this culture of gods that existed and were so pervasive in their society. But this seemed often quite bizarre to the Roman people, why they chose not to show any reverence or respect toward all of these other gods. They understood monotheism. Judaism had been around quite a while, and they understood the sole God of the Jews. But even the Jews participated in society, and they somewhat tolerated the polytheistic culture of the Roman society. And so they kind of tolerated the Romans, but they couldn't tolerate the Christians because the Christians refused to participate or even tolerate the existence of the polytheistic culture of the Romans. It even got to the point now it started to affect the economy. The building projects and obviously the idols and we hear about the silversmith issue whatsoever, and it became a crime. We have a letter recorded by Herodotus, written by Pliny, that talked about he struggled how to even deal with the Christians, and he executed a few in the hopes that he could hopefully put fear in the Christians not to continue down this path. The Christians really did have a different type of faith, and it challenged society, but it kept on growing. They really did grow up as an island out of this sea of gods during the first century AD. So now we come to the meat of the matter. Herodotus did a really good job of showing the distinction between religions and between faiths of the Roman era versus Christianity. But I felt like he lacked something. And what he lacked was, why did this new faith appeal so much to this group of people that they were willing to be ostracized and ridiculed, executed, and stand so far from society? And not only were they willing to do that, the movement grew and it grew and it grew. And so Herodotus didn't address that. And I think I have an idea of what it is. It has to do with this personal relationship. And I think it has to do with what we call the eschatological hope that Jesus provides. Paul touched on this when he said that God showed his riches and his glories in Jesus, in the hope of Jesus. And then he also said to the letter to the Romans in chapter 5, verses 5, that hope will not fail you. And that meant something to the Greco-Roman culture, because they had two gods that they looked at that went by the name of hope, not the hope of Jesus Christ, but went by the name of hope. They had the Spes, hope, who was the imperial hope, the hope in the man who was the emperor, which always fails you. And he was temporal. They couldn't depend upon him for anything. And then there was this little deity within the Greek culture called Elpis. And if you know the story of Pandora's box, when she let out all of her evils and trials upon the world, Elpis was in that box to help mankind, and Elpis was closed in that box when she closed the box. So Elpis was not released upon the world to give man any hope that he will ever be able to survive all the trials and tribulations. So to the Roman culture, hope was temporal and was not something they could depend upon. And then all of a sudden, this group of people had this faith of a relationship with a God that says, hope does exist. and he exists in a person called Jesus Christ. No wonder these people who lived in a culture where hope really didn't have presence found such a drawing into a group of people to face the ostracism and the ridicule and separate themselves from society because there was a hope that was being presented to them, a future they could look to, an eternal future with a God that actually cared about them. Not like all their cultural gods that maybe they assumed might help them, but a God that truly cared about them and would provide for them and take care of them and love them and interact with them. No wonder this Roman group drew on to this new faith that presented itself, rose up like an island out of this sea, this massive sea of falsity, of paganism and polytheism that provided no hope and nothing for men to hang themselves onto into a relationship with God. I pray and I hope that every one of us will be like those people and rise up out of our culture and be the islands where everybody is drawn to Christ because of what we do, just like they did. Thank you for our time. I think Gerardo did a fantastic job of presenting this concept of how we are so distinct. It'll be something we can all use and go forward with in our own ministries. Have a great day. Bye-bye.